In a primetime live broadcast watched by over 12 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walks into what was promised as a fair debate. But beneath the lights of Justice in Focus, she finds herself ambushed by a rigged panel and a weaponized clip, carefully edited to destroy her. Across from her looms Judge Gerald Whitman, a 37-year titan of the federal bench. Armed with arrogance, dripping with disdain, and hiding financial secrets that could shake the very foundation of the judiciary. But Jasmine doesn't flinch. She lets the silence stretch like a blade, then opens a single folder, and in just 90 seconds, turns a nationally televised ambush into the most devastating exposure of judicial corruption in years. What did she reveal? So explosive, so undeniable, it made a federal judge stutter and froze millions in absolute, breathless silence. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the sleek, high-gloss studio of Justice in Focus, everything gleamed with calculated perfection. But behind the glow, a trap had been set. Jasmine Crockett had been invited under the banner of civil discourse, her name framed in gold across promotional clips. The network promising an even-handed national conversation between seasoned voices of justice. But Jasmine wasn't naive. She'd felt it from the moment her assistant showed her the contract. Tight time slots, no access to segment questions, and an ominous live audience clause buried in fine print. Still, she came. Because when you've stood in courtrooms where silence can be deadlier than bullets, you don't back down from lights and cameras. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that just 5 minutes before airtime, producers would broadcast a doctored video from 2018. A heated floor debate taken wildly out of context, clipped to make her look like she supported defunding veterans programs. The clip rolled as if it were breaking news. No disclaimer, no chance to respond. Just gasps from the studio audience, and a camera slowly panning to the empty chair reserved for Jasmine Crockett, framing her as guilty before she had even walked in. When Jasmine finally stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Not out of respect, but calculation. The lighting above her wasn't warm and flattering like for the judge's side. It was surgical and cold, casting harsh shadows beneath her eyes. The host, once a White House communications director under a Republican administration, offered a smirk dressed as neutrality. Her microphone had been turned down 2 decibels lower than the judge's. The teleprompter script, unknown to her, contained phrasing like controversial, volatile, and disgraced, all prefacing her name. She could feel the tension from the front row, corporate execs in suits, eyes gleaming not with curiosity, but with hunger for scandal. It wasn't a conversation. It was a media execution with commercial breaks. She was meant to unravel, to lash out, to confirm the version of her they had just fed to millions. But what they didn't understand was that Jasmine had walked into far worse arenas before, and she knew exactly how to weaponize silence, evidence, and timing like a blade. But just as Jasmine adjusted to the battlefield disguised as a stage, the real strike walked in, draped in authority and wrapped in applause. Federal Judge Gerald Whitman entered not like a guest, but like a ruling monarch surveying his courtroom from above. Every step he took was deliberate, weighted with entitlement, as if the floor had been laid for him alone. The lights shifted subtly to highlight his arrival, casting a soft gold aura around him while leaving Jasmine in stark white glare, like predator and prey caught in separate frames of the same film. The applause didn't come from admiration. It was manufactured, queued up by studio handlers, eager to inject power into the atmosphere. His suit, a custom charcoal ensemble with hand-stitched lapels, gleamed under the studio beams. The man carried no notes, no documents, just arrogance woven into posture, his eyes glinting with the cold assurance of someone used to watching others fold. As he sat across from Jasmine, he didn't acknowledge her presence, not with a nod, not with a glance. He adjusted his tie, folded his hands, and turned to the host like Jasmine wasn't even there. Then, with a smile that was all edge and no warmth, he launched the first missile. "Before we begin," he said, voice like crushed velvet laced with ice, Can someone clarify for me the purpose of inviting a former congresswoman, no longer in office, to speak on constitutional integrity? No preamble, no courtesy, just surgical detonation. The camera slowly panned to Jasmine, but not to give her a platform, to study her reaction, to catch her flinch. She didn't give them one. Her jaw held firm, her eyes still. Whitman wasn't done. He leaned slightly forward, theatrically, like a man dishing out hard truths to a misled child. Ms. Crockett, you had your time in public service. That time expired. The voters spoke. They closed that chapter. And yet here you are, seated across from a federal judge, insisting you still speak for the American people? Each phrase was crafted not for intellectual debate, but to humiliate. He didn't challenge her ideas. He challenged her right to exist in the room. His tone was that of a gatekeeper guarding the sanctity of law from what he implied was an unqualified intruder. The host nodded solemnly, subtly validating the insult by moving on as if nothing outrageous had just been said. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Whitman mistook that for weakness, like many before him had. But what he failed to notice was the subtle shift in the air, the way the silence around Jasmine was not submissive, but strategic. She was not retreating. She was letting him dig the hole himself, inch by inch, with every syllable soaked in superiority. He thought he was building a case. What he was building was a collapse. He thought he was building a case. What he was building was a collapse. Jasmine didn't meet his words with words. She met them with stillness, one of those rare, piercing silences that doesn't seek permission to dominate a room. The air seemed to constrict as she sat motionless, not defensive, not afraid, just calculating. Her posture remained unshaken, her eyes fixed not on Whitman, not on the host, but on the folder beside her. It was off-white, clean, with a single brass clip at the top. A folder that didn't scream but whispered, "I know more than you think." And then with the kind of deliberate grace that rewrites a room's rhythm, she reached for it. One motion, smooth, no drama. But the silence that followed was deafening. No camera crew shifted, no audience member coughed. No host dared interrupt. It was like someone had drained the oxygen, and all anyone could do was watch. She placed the folder gently on the polished glass desk, aligning it perfectly with the table's edge, and flicked it open. The studio lights caught the pale shimmer of the first page as she slid it forward. Not to read, but simply to let it exist. Not one headline, not one quote, just crisp print in the weight of context, something that couldn't be edited into a clip. It wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't even a response. It was evidence, and it demanded silence. Whitman's earlier grin didn't vanish outright. It fractured, hairline cracks forming in real time as he tried to process the shift he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't playing defense. She was setting the stage for a prosecution, one sheet at a time. What made it more devastating was that Jasmine never sped up. She moved like a woman in control of every heartbeat in the room. She didn't apologize for taking her time. She owned it. The host glanced nervously at the teleprompter, realizing Jasmine had just hijacked the pace of a show designed to humiliate her. The producers had written a script, hot, reactive, designed for outbursts and viral meltdowns. But what they got was the opposite. A woman who'd turned stillness into spectacle and silence into dominance. She hadn't raised her voice once. But somehow, in less than 60 seconds, Jasmine Crockett had made the judge, the host, and the entire studio feel exactly what it's like to sit in front of a loaded file they never expected to see open, live. She hadn't raised her voice once. But somehow, in less than 60 seconds, Jasmine Crockett had made the judge, the host, and the entire studio feel exactly what it's like to sit in front of a loaded file they never expected to see opened, live. And now, with the room's oxygen stripped bare, she began to speak. Not fast, not emotional, but with a slowness that cut deeper than outrage ever could. Jasmine slid the first page from the folder and held it flat between her fingers, lifting it toward the studio cameras with the calm authority of someone who had already rehearsed this moment 100 times, not in front of a mirror, but in her bones. "Let's begin with something simple," she said, her voice low but sharp, each syllable carved with intention. A contract. On the overhead monitor behind them, the image flickered to life. A scanned PDF, faint creases visible where it had once been folded in thirds. It was a legal agreement dated May 6th from 3 years prior. At the top, in all caps, Halcyon Tech Group, Inc. Beneath that, bolded text, Retained Counsel, Whitman and Associates, PLLC. The camera zoomed in on the signature. It was clean, unmistakable, and elegantly cruel. Gerald E. Whitman. Jasmine didn't glance at the host. She didn't spare the audience a single look. Her eyes were locked on Whitman, who was no longer smirking, no longer seated like a man orchestrating a televised lesson. He was frozen, too proud to look away, too stunned to interrupt. You provided legal counsel, Jasmine continued, to Halcyon Tech while serving as managing partner of your firm. That alone isn't illegal, but what's curious, she turned the page slowly, almost reverently, is what happened after you took the bench. She laid out the next document, this time a financial transaction record. It had the feel of something ripped from a federal indictment. 3 highlighted rows with red boxes drawn around them. Dates, amounts, destinations. 3 transfers, she said, each word precise and deliberate. 100,000, then 250,000, then 200,000, all originating from Halcyon's executive fund. All routed through a shell company, Lancer Holdings International, before landing in a domestic trust titled Whitman Family Holdings, LLC. On the screen, the document magnified. The wire codes matched. The dates were damning. The final transfer had cleared just 48 hours after Whitman's courtroom ruled, unanimously and with alarming speed, in Halcyon's favor during a multi-million-dollar federal liability suit. This money, Jasmine said, pausing to let the words breathe, didn't arrive by coincidence. It arrived like payment. The host shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. Someone offstage murmured into an earpiece. The camera operator hesitated, then slowly pulled focus toward Whitman's face. Tense, pale, blinking faster now. Still, Jasmine didn't waver. She lifted the third document. A 2-page form, simple but fatal. A mandatory financial disclosure for all federal judges, signed under penalty of perjury. The page looked ordinary to the untrained eye, until Jasmine flipped to the back and circled in thick red ink the absence of one specific line: offshore assets. This, she said, holding it up like a final verdict, is your official disclosure filed with the Judicial Ethics Office last September. According to this, you claim 0 offshore financial interests. She let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2, 3, and then, and yet, she added, sliding forward a notarized deed of title, this Cayman Islands property, registered under a holding account with a matching family trust ID, tells a very different story. The screen split into 2. On the left, the financial disclosure, signed by Whitman. On the right, the luxury property deed, registered in Grand Cayman, matched to Whitman's wife's name, but funded through the same LLC shown in the wire transfer. The camera zoomed in on the matching tax ID numbers. Jasmine didn't need to say the word fraud. It was already written across every detail, now glowing under the lights. Whitman tried to speak. He opened his mouth, his throat tightening with disbelief, but nothing came. Not a denial, not a demand. Just silence, caught in the teeth of a woman who had just turned his past into a weapon. Jasmine leaned back slightly, not smug, not vindictive, just resolved. Her next words were almost too calm. You asked earlier what gave me the right to be here, she said. But the better question is, what gave you the right to judge anyone? While hiding everything you were being paid to forget? The host inhaled to interrupt, but stopped. There was nowhere to go. No commercial break could wash this out. The studio, which had been built to humiliate Jasmine, now became a courtroom without a gavel, and the gavel was in her hands. And through it all, she never once raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had the truth. And the truth didn't yell. It revealed. She had turned their trap into a courtroom. But now from the far edge of the broadcast stage, another figure stepped forward. one who had lived behind the curtain of Judge Whitman's empire and was finally ready to tear it down. The sound came first. A pair of heels, slow, steady, clicking against the polished concrete floor behind the cameras. At first, no one turned. The audience was frozen, all eyes glued to the screen, still split in half. Whitman's unsigned Cayman disclosure on one side, Jasmine's damning evidence on the other. The judge had not moved. His hands were clenched in his lap now, his eyes unfocused, his expression lost somewhere between disbelief and dread. Then the camera cut. She appeared from stage left, graceful, unshaken. Not part of the show, yet suddenly the centerpiece. Her hair was silver, pinned tightly back in a judicial-style twist. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no political pins. Just a navy blue blazer and a pair of worn brown shoes that told you she hadn't come to perform. She had come to testify. A producer's voice cracked in the studio booth. "Who the hell is that?" But it was too late. The audience gasped. Whitman finally looked up, and in that instant, the room understood. He knew exactly who she was. She walked to the center of the stage without hesitation, clutching a worn manila folder against her side like a final piece of unfinished business. Jasmine didn't turn to greet her. She didn't need to. She simply slid her folder aside, making space on the glass table for something even heavier than evidence: memory. The woman stepped beside Jasmine. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly into camera 2, the close-up lens trained on the table. Her voice was soft, but the weight behind it could break concrete. "My name is Judith Callahan. I served as chief clerk for the Honorable Judge Gerald Whitman from 2011 to 2022. No host had introduced her. No lower third banner appeared on the screen. She didn't need one. The silence she commanded did all the work. I managed his court calendar, his briefings, the scheduling of all civil litigation that passed through Chambers 3. She continued, voice steady, breath controlled. And I was the last person to see every file before it reached his desk. She opened the manila folder, hands precise, methodical, and drew out a single page, then placed it beneath the overhead projector. The studio screen responded instantly. It was an internal memo, dated, time-stamped, her initials on the top right corner. The subject line read, "Request to prioritize Halcyon v. Placer County, Chambers Directive." The camera zoomed in. Below, in short handwritten instruction, "Fast-track pretrial to summary judgment. Expedite docket slot." The handwriting matched previous samples from Whitman. A quiet tremor ran through the crowd. The memo didn't shout corruption, but it whispered complicity. "I received memos like this more than once," Judith said. "They always involved companies with prior links to the judge's former law firm or to accounts connected to Whitman family holdings. I followed orders because I thought it wasn't my place to question a federal judge." She stopped and looked directly at Whitman. He didn't meet her eyes. "But it is our place," she said. "All of us. Especially when silence becomes the shield that lets people like him operate without accountability." The host finally tried to interrupt, his voice brittle. "Ms. Callahan, are you saying Judge Whitman knowingly requested case prioritization for firms with financial connections to him?" She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "I'm saying he made those requests. I'm saying I complied. And I'm saying I was wrong to stay silent." The screen behind her changed again. More memos, more scheduling flags, all linking high-value corporate litigation to preferential docketing under Whitman's command. But it wasn't just the documents that hit. It was the tone in Judith's voice. Not anger, not revenge. Something far deeper. Conscience. "I came here today not because someone asked me to," she continued. "Not because I want attention, but because I watched this show live last week. I saw how Judge Whitman mocked Representative Crockett. I saw how the media framed her as angry, emotional, unqualified, because that's what people like him do when their power is threatened by the truth." The audience leaned in. Even the camera crew had gone still. Judith took a long, slow breath, then delivered the line that no one in the building would ever forget. "I may be retired, I may not wear the robe, but I am still a citizen. And I choose loyalty to the truth, not to the man who sat behind the bench." The words didn't echo. They detonated. Whitman's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. He reached for a glass of water that wasn't there. Jasmine hadn't moved once. And Judith Callahan. She placed the final document on the table, gently closed her folder, and stepped back into silence. Not needing applause, not seeking permission, just walking off the set. Having told the truth, the system never expected her to speak aloud, and now that system was cracking. Judith Callahan's final words didn't echo. They settled, heavy, final. And in that silence, all the illusions Whitman had cloaked himself in began to dissolve. He sat there for a moment, frozen. The sharp, polished authority he had wielded just 15 minutes earlier was now crumbling in real time, before cameras, under lights, and in front of millions. His hands shifted on the desk, unsure of where to rest. His eyes darted, not in defiance, but in search of something he no longer had: control. Then, like a man waking from a nightmare he didn't realize was real, Whitman cleared his throat. This is ridiculous, he said, voice thinner than anyone expected. You people, you don't know what you're doing. His words came out staccato, grasping for structure, for safety. This entire spectacle has been manipulated, politically motivated. He gestured broadly, as if waving off the piles of damning documents laid bare beside Jasmine Crockett. His voice cracked again, this time on the word political, as though even his larynx refused to cooperate with the lie. He shifted in his seat. Sweat glinted just beneath his brow. He tried to chuckle, but it came out dry. Laughter stripped of confidence. You think this is justice? You're being used, all of you. This is a staged ambush, a left-wing media circus designed to humiliate me in public. His voice climbed a pitch too high, veering into desperation. There are protocols, due process. This isn't how these things are handled. I'm a federal judge. But no one answered. The host stared forward, pale. The audience remained motionless. Even the camera operators had stopped adjusting focus. The only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of electrical equipment and Whitman's shallow, panicked breathing. He turned finally to Jasmine Crockett, the woman he had mocked, underestimated, and tried to destroy with clipped sound bites and calculated disrespect. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply met his gaze, not with triumph, but with the serene steadiness of someone who had nothing left to prove. And that was what unmoored him the most. Whitman reached for one of the documents in front of him, as if hoping to somehow reinterpret it mid-broadcast, but his hand trembled. These records are incomplete, he mumbled. There are explanations, context. You're painting a false narrative. This is bigger than me. He said it like an accusation, but it landed like an admission. And then, from behind the dark curtains at stage right, came the sound that broke everything. Two firm, synchronized sets of footsteps. Crisp, measured, purposeful. Whitman looked toward the sound instinctively, and when he saw the two men emerging, both in tailored black suits, both wearing federal credentials clipped to their belts, his posture shifted like a collapsing tower. No one announced them. They didn't need it. Their presence was the announcement. They moved without showmanship, without urgency. One of them, the taller of the two, walked up beside Whitman's chair and bent slightly to whisper in his ear. No one else heard the words, but the audience saw the effect. Whitman's face went pale. He whispered back, something shaky, unintelligible. But the agent calmly straightened, gave a short nod, and placed a light hand on Whitman's shoulder. Not a forceful grab, just enough to remind him of the weight of the law behind it. I want to make a statement, Whitman said suddenly, voice hoarse. You can't do this. Not on live television. He stood wobbly. This is unlawful. This is a travesty. His words fell into the air like broken glass, sharp but useless. The shorter agent stepped beside him now, guiding him from the side. The two agents began to walk him toward the back of the stage, one on each side. There were no handcuffs. No cuffs were necessary. His posture said more than shackles ever could. As he passed the front row of the audience, one woman pressed a hand to her lips. A man closed his eyes. A younger viewer simply stared, frozen. No one cheered. No one clapped. No one smirked. Because what had just unfolded was not entertainment. It was exposure. And the silence in the studio now wasn't awkward. It was sacred. The cameras kept rolling, and for a few seconds the broadcast offered no words. Just the image of a man who once sat at the pinnacle of legal power, being walked away from the very institution he'd tried to weaponize. He reached the curtain, and just before vanishing into shadow, he turned once more. This time not to plead, but to look back at the seat he once ruled from. It was empty now, lit by studio lights, framed by truth, and it would never belong to him again. Whitman vanished behind the black curtain, but the silence he left didn't vanish with him. It metastasized through the control room, across the newsroom, and into every glowing screen across America. The moment didn't end when he exited stage left. In fact, that's when it truly began. The producers had no choice but to keep the cameras rolling. Every second of the live stream, every flicker of Whitman's unraveling, every line from Judith Callahan, and every silent page Jasmine laid down was captured in raw, uncut detail. The broadcast ended not with credits, but with stunned silence. Then a hard cut to emergency news anchors fumbling to summarize what the nation had just witnessed. But they were already too late. Within minutes, the internet ignited. The clip, just over 9 minutes long, began circulating under one instruction: watch. It started with political accounts, then legal forums, then journalists, then universities. By the time the East Coast was halfway through dinner, the footage had spread through every major online platform and television screen. No commentary could contain it, no spin could control it, and no one could unsee it. It wasn't just what Jasmine said, it was how she didn't say it. The restraint, the silence, the surgical exposure of fact without fury, the ivory folder, the overhead camera. The moment she slid the Cayman Islands document under the lens without speaking a word, and the room collapsed under the weight of what it revealed. Clips were cut, recut, replayed endlessly. One widely shared post showed Jasmine mid-turn toward the screen, her expression composed and steady, with the caption, "This is how you end a legacy, with proof, not noise." On legal discussion boards, former prosecutors, sitting judges, and law professors chimed in like jurors finally unshackled. Professor Elaine Raskin from Yale Law School posted, "What Jasmine Crockett just did isn't just brave. It's a masterclass in legal exposure under pressure. This will be taught." Her comment was reposted thousands of times within hours. An hour later, Stanford Law Professor Emeritus Derek Hanley weighed in live on a national news program. "We just watched something we don't often get in American legal history: accountability in real time." Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended the credibility of the bench itself by tearing off the mask. This is, without exaggeration, the kind of moment that reshapes public trust. Clips from that interview were embedded into law school seminars by the end of the week. Students who'd only known Jasmine Crockett from headlines were now analyzing her approach in constitutional law classes, studying not just her strategy, but her stillness. In comment sections and student groups, people who hadn't known what a judicial disclosure form was on Monday were quoting procedural ethics by Friday. "This wasn't theater," one law clerk wrote. "It was justice rendered live, by someone who knew when to stay silent and when to strike." Memes appeared almost instantly, but these weren't the mocking kind. They carried a reverence. One image showed Jasmine holding the ivory folder like a sword. Another showed the judge's face mid-denial, paired with the phrase, "Power doesn't protect you from consequence." Television news struggled to keep up. On cable, analysts talked over each other, trying to frame the clip within familiar narratives. A few hosts floated theories that it was a coordinated setup, a trap. But even skeptics acknowledged the authenticity of the documents, the credibility of the witnesses, and the clarity of what had been revealed. In downtown Washington, D.C., a spontaneous panel gathered on a law school rooftop, organized by graduate students within hours of the broadcast. A projector replayed the moment Judith Callahan declared, "I choose loyalty to the truth, not the man who sat behind the bench." No one interrupted. No one laughed. The audience stood still. A former federal ethics officer in attendance leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "I've waited my whole career to see someone say that out loud." And Jasmine? She posted nothing. No statement, no comment, no camera phone response. The absence of her voice after the clip aired became its own message. Because now everyone understood. This wasn't about one moment on television. It wasn't about victory or revenge. It wasn't even about being right. It was about what happens when a woman walks into a media trap, is set up to lose, and calmly turns every camera, every mic, and every word against those who planned her fall, and does it not with volume, but with undeniable truth. Not theater, not spectacle, just evidence, presented under pressure with the kind of grace that makes institutions shake. As the nation digested the footage frame by frame, a second shockwave tore through the narrative. Not from the stage, not from Jasmine, but from inside the machine itself. Late into the night, while clips of Jasmine's quiet defiance still surged across networks and group chats, an anonymous whistleblower, an assistant segment producer only identified in news reports as LC, forwarded a string of internal emails to 3 investigative reporters. No subject line, just attachments. What they uncovered was not just unethical, it was engineered malice, typed in plain language and stamped with corporate logos. At the center of the leak was a single line in bold, written by a senior producer just 5 days before the broadcast. The email read, "The goal is simple. Rattle her, break her rhythm, and let her melt down on air. We need a viral moment. Make her the meme, not the message." The words hit like shrapnel. Cold, calculated, unmistakably racist, and horrifyingly familiar to anyone who'd ever been reduced to a caricature because of their skin, their voice, or their strength. Within hours, the documents were authenticated. The timestamps matched the pre-show scheduling logs. The sender was a longtime executive producer of the program, the same man who had introduced Jasmine Crockett that night with forced charm and artificial smiles. Other emails outlined talking points for the host, including directives to steer her into agitation and cut her mic if she monologues. One even attached a pre-cut sizzle reel of a past committee hearing where Jasmine had raised her voice against a hostile witness, edited to remove context and amplify emotion. The subject line? Use this to remind the audience who she really is. There was no ambiguity. The broadcast wasn't journalism. It was a setup, a psychological ambush designed to exploit stereotypes for ratings. And Jasmine had walked into it knowing none of this. The backlash erupted with volcanic force. Civil rights organizations issued coordinated statements within 12 hours. The National Black Lawyers Association condemned the network by name, calling it a modern digital lynching disguised as a panel show. The NAACP labeled it an orchestrated degradation of black female leadership. Legal advocacy groups, many of whom had stayed cautious during the earlier stages, now spoke with fire. Professor Mariah Bentley, a Harvard law scholar who rarely commented on media events, appeared live on PBS and delivered a searing statement. This wasn't just a broadcast. It was the weaponization of stereotype for commercial gain. They didn't expect her to stay calm because they didn't believe she was capable of it. And when she dismantled their trap in silence, they lost the mask. But now we see it. The public turned fast and hard. By morning, the program's sponsor list had dwindled by half. A cascade of advertisers pulled their support, citing ethical misalignment. Internally, multiple staffers resigned, including 2 associate producers and one of the camera operators, who released a short video on social media explaining that everything from the lighting to the teleprompter angles was calibrated to provoke her. An online petition demanding the show's cancellation surged past 1 million signatures in less than 36 hours. But the most damning blow came when a former co-host of the program, once seen as a staple of the network's political coverage, went on a rival outlet and confirmed it wasn't the first time. "I saw this pattern years ago. They invite voices like Jasmine's to appear neutral, but what they really want is the moment they can cut, clip, and ridicule. It's never about dialogue, it's about control." The atmosphere shifted from outrage to reckoning. Suddenly, every black woman who'd ever been talked over on a panel, every whistleblower dismissed for being too emotional, every truth teller edited down to a soundbite, they all had a name to anchor their pain to: Jasmine Crockett. Students began organizing viewings of the clip, not just as spectacle, but as study. What does it mean to be invited only to be destroyed? How do you maintain composure when every light, mic, and script has been loaded against you? Professors called it a case study in modern systemic targeting through broadcast. And still, Jasmine remained silent. No interviews, no social media post, no late-night talk show tour, because the facts were speaking louder than anything she could possibly say. And now the very industry that had tried to bait her into losing her temper was losing its grip on the narrative. Badly. A second leaked email surfaced 2 days later, this one from a network executive, sent internally after Jasmine had already begun her quiet exposure on air. It read, "She's not breaking. We need to pivot. Redirect to Vittman's experience. Remind the audience of his legacy." But the audience had already made up its mind. They'd seen what she faced. And more importantly, they'd seen how she didn't flinch. The demand for justice didn't end when the camera stopped rolling. It began. What Jasmine Crockett had ignited on live television, the silent surgical dismantling of Judge Whitman's facade, became more than a viral moment. It cracked open a door the public didn't even know had been locked. And what lay behind it was darker than anyone wanted to believe. A judiciary with unchecked power, financial entanglements, and no mechanism for real accountability. Within 48 hours, a coalition of civil rights groups and public transparency organizations launched an unprecedented joint appeal. The names behind the letter read like a war roster for truth: the American Civil Liberties Union, the Brennan Center, the National Black Lawyers Association, Public Citizen, Judicial Integrity Now. Their language was uncompromising. "We call for a full federal audit of every sitting judge's assets, domestic and offshore. This includes family trusts, third-party investments, undeclared conflicts, and historical case outcomes influenced by private interest. If judges are to wield justice, they must not hide from it." The petition reached 1 million signatures in less than a week. It wasn't just lawyers and legal scholars signing. It was veterans, nurses, students, single mothers, small business owners. The public had seen what unchecked power looked like, and they were ready to pull the curtain back on every black robe in America. News anchors no longer opened with sports or overseas updates. They opened with this: how deep does the corruption go? A nationwide survey revealed 62% of Americans no longer trusted the federal judiciary to act impartially. Legal podcasts surged in downloads. Public radio stations aired anonymous whistleblower accounts from inside district courts. One former judicial assistant told NPR, "I watched my judge approve a ruling on a case involving a corporation whose CEO funded his daughter's wedding, and no one batted an eye." As pressure mounted, America's top law schools did something they had never done before. They united. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, Howard, and Berkeley announced a joint emergency symposium, broadcast live and free to the public, titled "Justice and Shadow Power: Where is the Line?" The title alone set the internet ablaze. Commentators debated it. Memes were made. But underneath the cultural noise, something serious was brewing. The symposium was to be held at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. A deliberate choice. The very building where landmark legal arguments were once crafted would now be the arena for their dissection. The day of the event, the steps outside Constitution Hall were packed before sunrise. Not just academics, veterans in wheelchairs, young activists with notebooks, old civil rights leaders with trembling hands. The air buzzed like a revolution trying to remember its name. Inside, the banners were unmissable. The robe is not immunity. Accountability is not disrespect. Justice cannot exist in the shadows. The keynote speaker, Professor Nia Barrett of Howard University, stood beneath blinding stage lights and delivered a statement that felt like thunder through the marble hall. When judges are not required to be transparent, justice becomes a commodity. When power is unmonitored, it mutates into abuse. Today we ask not for revenge, but for clarity, not for spectacle, but for safeguards. And we demand it not as citizens alone, but as the last line between democracy and decay. Her speech was followed by panels composed of whistleblower judges in silhouette, law students reading leaked clerk memos, Ethicists showing graphs of case rulings versus known political donors. Every 15 minutes, another layer peeled back. Real estate gifts, unreported income, rulings delivered in under 30 seconds without trial. Then came the moment that shattered the air. A 19-year-old law student from Spelman College stood up during Q&A. Her voice was clear, her tone unshaking. If Jasmine Crockett hadn't exposed this live on TV, how long would Judge Whitman have continued? How many more would have fallen under the weight of a system that doesn't fear being seen? The room went still. One by one, professors and judges, some shaking with emotion, rose to sign a new charter drafted by the Symposium Committee, the Covenant for Transparent Justice. Its demands were bold but precise: independent oversight of all federal judges by a publicly accountable body. Real-time, publicly accessible financial disclosures. Mandatory recusal enforcement tied to algorithmic conflict flagging systems. Term limits for lifetime appointments or, at minimum, performance reviews every 7 years. The charter was sent that same night to every sitting senator and representative. No one left the hall cheering. They left electrified, ashamed, ready. And though Jasmine Crockett said nothing in the days that followed, her silence was deafening, not because it lacked meaning, but because it had already echoed in every institution now shaking. She hadn't just exposed one corrupt man, she had made the country question the temple he stood in. The world wanted to crown her, commercialize her defiance, and turn a courtroom reckoning into a media campaign. But Jasmine Crockett refused to let the truth she fought for become entertainment. The media frenzy didn't wait. It crashed in like a flood. Within 24 hours of the televised takedown, Jasmine Crockett's inbox overflowed. CNN, MSNBC, The View, HBO, even late-night comedy shows, each begging for a segment, an exclusive, a headline. Agents pitched six-figure book deals with ghostwriters already attached. A streaming platform offered to dramatize the courtroom moment, complete with an A-list actress who could capture Jasmine's fire. Fashion magazines wanted photo shoots. Universities proposed honorary degrees. Everyone wanted a piece of her, to elevate her as the next symbol of truth, of resilience, of defiant womanhood in the face of power. And yet, she said nothing. While the world tried to repackage her silence, Jasmine disappeared. No press releases, no interviews, no carefully curated PR statements. She retreated to her district, to her apartment 2 blocks from the community legal center she once interned at. Her team, those who knew her best, watched in stunned awe as she declined opportunity after opportunity. "You're walking away from the biggest moment of your life," one producer warned over voicemail. But Jasmine had seen too much manipulation, too many performances disguised as justice. She had no intention of letting the truth be diluted by applause. Behind closed doors, she reviewed every offer. She saw the language: exclusive rights, editorial control, public relations coordination. They didn't want her story. They wanted her likeness. And that, to Jasmine, was dangerous. Because if they could turn her into a brand, they could make others believe justice needed a perfect face, a spotlight, a microphone. That the only way to confront power was with millions watching. But Jasmine had faced the storm alone. No script, no PR team, just facts, courage, and a folder of truth. And she wanted others to know that was enough. The only message she allowed to escape came quietly, almost unintentionally. A handwritten letter from a 19-year-old pre-law student in Philadelphia had arrived at her office. The girl wrote about watching the hearing at a bus station, how she cried as Jasmine stayed composed under attack, how it made her believe for the first time that the law wasn't just for the rich and white and powerful. She ended the note with a question. "Do you feel proud of being a symbol now?" Jasmine read the letter 3 times. She didn't hand it off to a staffer. She didn't send a canned reply. She sat at her desk in a hoodie, no cameras in sight, and wrote back in ink that barely dried before she mailed it. The note was only 4 lines. "Symbols can't speak, but people can. I don't need to be remembered. I need others to feel safe doing what I did. That's how justice grows." The student, overwhelmed, shared it online. It was screenshotted, reposted, and dissected within hours. Social media lit up not because Jasmine had said something grand, but because she had refused to say anything that made her bigger than the cause. Commentators didn't know what to do with that. In a world where everyone chased virality, here was a woman who had gone viral and walked away from it on purpose. Political strategists whispered that she was missing her moment. One network anchor said, "This is what happens when activists don't know how to transition to leadership." But they misunderstood Jasmine entirely. She didn't want to be a headline. She wanted to remain a warning shot, a reminder that truth doesn't always need a sequel, that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do after a revolution is step back and leave room for someone else to rise. In private, Jasmine returned to her roots. She visited classrooms in silence, sitting in the back row while students debated court ethics. She walked through her old neighborhood without security, stopping by a bodega whose owner had taped her face to the register like a trophy. She smiled, but she didn't linger. When asked for quotes, she only said, "Keep watching the courts. They count on you forgetting." Meanwhile, every declined invitation seemed to say something louder than a speech. By staying silent, Jasmine had shifted the narrative. She wasn't just the woman who exposed a federal judge. She was now the woman who taught the country how dangerous it is to chase justice as spectacle. And the more she refused the spotlight, the more powerful her shadow became. The silence wasn't passive, it was defiance, a choice, a refusal to let justice be sold back to the public as a Netflix trailer or a TikTok moment. Jasmine knew what they wanted: to crown her, commercialize her, then forget her once the ratings dipped. But instead, she chose to become something they couldn't control, a whisper that grew into thunder. She didn't disappear, she distanced. And in that distance, a message lingered: don't watch for me. Watch who they try to silence next. That, more than any award or standing ovation, would be her legacy. While Jasmine's silence echoed across the nation, in the chambers of Congress, the aftermath of her defiance began to harden into policy, and a new battle for transparency ignited. The air in the Capitol felt charged, thick with urgency, with consequence. It had been less than 3 weeks since the broadcast that shattered illusions about judicial neutrality, and already a bipartisan group of lawmakers was gathering signatures, readying podiums, and preparing to detonate the next bombshell. Not through a folder of leaked documents, but through legislation. They called it the Judicial Trust Act, and it was more than a bill. It was a direct shot across the bow of unchecked judicial power. The room was packed when the press conference began. Reporters, legal analysts, civil rights advocates, everyone sensed this wasn't just another hollow gesture meant to die in committee. This had momentum. At the center stood Representative Elijah Tatum, a veteran legislator known for quiet resolve rather than fiery speeches. But this time, he looked carved from stone, his voice taut with moral clarity. Cameras clicked as he held up a single sheet of paper and said, "This is not about politics. This is about the soul of our republic." Behind him stood an unlikely alliance: Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives, some holding folders, others clutching their talking points like shields. What united them wasn't ideology, but outrage. Outrage that a man in robes could sell verdicts behind closed doors and still demand the public call him honorable. The Judicial Trust Act, Tatum explained, would require every federal judge to publicly disclose their complete financial holdings, domestic and offshore, every gift, every consulting fee, every transaction made by spouses, children, or shell corporations tied to them. But the bill didn't stop there. It also required judges to disclose all personal relationships, professional, financial, or familial, with entities or firms appearing before their court. No more vague potential conflicts. No more "we trust their judgment." This time, trust would be earned, under penalty of law. Then came the quote that would echo across headlines that night and dominate news cycles for days. Tatum didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the podium. He simply looked into the camera and said, "If we do not oversee those who administer justice, then justice itself becomes a cloak, draped not to protect the innocent, but to conceal the machinery of power." It landed like a thunderclap. Within hours, the quote appeared on the chyron of every major network. Political anchors debated it, law schools printed it, protesters stenciled it onto banners. It didn't matter that it came from a politician. It felt like something sacred, something overdue. For decades, the judiciary had been seen as the last untainted branch of government. But now, with Jasmine's revelations still raw in the public's mind, the myth had shattered. And the people weren't just ready for change. They were demanding it. Opposition came fast and furious. Judicial lobbying groups condemned the bill as an overreach, a dangerous politicization, and a slippery slope toward dismantling judicial independence. One retired circuit judge claimed it would make judges live in fear of populist retaliation. But those words rang hollow, because for once the public wasn't reacting with apathy. They were watching. And the images of Gerald Whitman being escorted off live television weren't fading. If anything, they had become a symbol of what happens when oversight fails. More lawmakers joined the fray. Senator Laura Montrose, herself a former prosecutor, took the floor during a late-night session and read aloud a list of over 30 judges who had ruled on cases involving companies tied to their financial portfolios, with no disclosure. Her voice cracked when she reached the name of a judge who dismissed a wrongful death suit while owning over $300,000 in stock in the defendant's corporation. "This isn't independence," she spat. "It's legalized betrayal." Legal scholars, once cautious in tone, began penning essays with titles like "The Hidden Empire of the Robe" and "When Justice Becomes a Market." One even went viral for calling the judiciary America's most polite cartel. The debate spilled into dinner tables, classrooms, barbershops, and church pews. And every time someone asked, "Isn't this too extreme?" someone else would answer, "Then explain Whitman." As the bill made its way to committee, Jasmine's name was invoked repeatedly, but she remained silent. Her refusal to politicize her moment had given the legislation more weight, not less. She wasn't rallying votes or campaigning on talk shows, but her presence was felt in every room, her face etched behind every demand for reform. She had become, unwillingly, the conscience of a bill she never endorsed, but silently fueled. The Judicial Trust Act wasn't just a response. It was a reckoning, a statement that no robe, no gavel, no courtroom architecture would be allowed to mask corruption again. And as hearings loomed, as analysts prepared for a bitter legislative war, one truth rang louder than any lobbyist's objection. This time the system was on trial, and the country was watching, finally with both eyes open. As Congress debated legislation born from her silence, Jasmine quietly slipped out of the political spotlight and into a room where the next generation of justice was still learning how to speak. The university's law auditorium buzzed with the kind of electricity only youth and purpose can create. Rows of fresh faces, some nervous, others brimming with idealism, filled the red velvet seats, flipping through programs printed in gold ink. National Student Forum on Legal Ethics and Accountability. It had been a week since the Judicial Trust Act was introduced, and Jasmine Crockett's name had come up in every single workshop. Her televised confrontation, her refusal to cash in, her note to the Philadelphia student, her ghostly absence. The students had turned her into a myth, a case study, a rallying cry. They never expected her to show up in person. She didn't arrive in a motorcade. No entourage. No announcement. Jasmine walked in through a side door, wearing a simple dark coat, no makeup, and her hair pulled back into a soft knot. She quietly slipped into the last row, unnoticed at first. Her presence wasn't declared, it was discovered. A second-year student spotted her and froze mid-sentence. Then another. Then a wave of murmurs rippled forward, polite but electric, like the moment a courtroom realizes the judge has entered. But Jasmine didn't move. She nodded at the few who turned to look, smiled faintly, and kept her eyes on the stage. It was a panel discussion about judicial power and public trust, moderated by a nervous third year who clutched her index cards like they might dissolve. The students, diverse in race, gender, ambition, spoke with passion, but there was an undercurrent of self-doubt. Every example they cited came back to the same question. What happens when the law becomes the very instrument of silence? Then after the final applause, the moderator cleared her throat. Her hands trembled. She scanned the audience and said, "We've just been informed that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is in the room. If she would be willing, we'd be honored." All heads turned. A pause. A breath. Jasmine stood up slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood what it meant to carry weight without wielding it. As she stepped forward, a strange hush fell over the crowd. There were no cheers, no wild applause, just the kind of quiet reserved for something sacred. She walked up the side steps of the stage and didn't head for the podium. She stopped just beside it, hands at her sides. And then she said just one sentence. "I don't need to say more today. The way you act after you leave this room will be the most beautiful answer you could ever give." It hit like thunder, not because it was loud, but because it was everything. In that moment, Jasmine stripped away every illusion about speeches, symbols, or saviors. She placed the responsibility not on history or institutions or lawmakers, but on them, the students, the ones who still had time to choose who they would become. The silence after her words wasn't awkward, it was reverent. She gave a short nod, then stepped down from the stage, and she didn't linger. She walked straight back to her seat, even as the auditorium pulsed with the urge to rise, to clap, to chase her for photos or autographs. But somehow, everyone understood. This wasn't a photo op. This was a challenge, a dare, a transfer of moral weight, and no one wanted to cheapen it with noise. After the forum ended, a few students approached her, not with cameras, but with questions that mattered. One girl asked, "How do you speak truth to power when no one believes you yet?" Jasmine looked her in the eye and said, "You keep speaking until someone does. Then you help them speak louder than you ever could." Another asked, "How do you know when it's your fight?" Jasmine replied, "If you're awake at night thinking about it, it's already yours." Still, she refused to let the attention linger. She left the auditorium through the same side door she came in. But what she left behind wasn't just inspiration, it was combustion. Students who had been unsure of their voices now whispered about internships at watchdog organizations. Others Googled the Judicial Trust Act for the first time. One even stood in the hallway after she left and said, "I thought we were supposed to follow precedent, but maybe it's time we write our own." Later that night, video clips from the event began to circulate, not of Jasmine speaking, but of the room's reaction, the quiet, the stillness, the weight. A legal podcast called it the most powerful 19 seconds in the history of law student activism. News outlets didn't know how to spin it. There was no drama, no soundbite, just an act of restraint that sparked a revolution of resolve. And while Jasmine slept that night, her inbox filled again. This time, not with TV offers or book deals, but with letters from students, junior attorneys, even first-year paralegals. They didn't ask for autographs. They asked for reading lists, for strategies, for advice on staying calm when the courtroom turns cruel. And in each of those messages was something she had hoped for all along. A voice that didn't want to be her, a voice that wanted to be heard. Jasmine never followed up. She didn't send mass replies. She didn't repost screenshots. But in a locked drawer in her home office, she kept a folder of those letters. And on the front, written in her own handwriting, were the same words she'd once spoken into a microphone without a podium. The way they act after today will be the most beautiful answer. The students rose with new resolve, the chambers echoed with reform, and the headlines blazed with Jasmine's name. But beneath the fire, beneath the noise, lay something deeper. A lesson no camera could capture and no courtroom could contain. In a world increasingly addicted to volume, where shouting often replaces truth and scandal is sold faster than sincerity, Jasmine Crockett's defiance didn't come from outrage. It came from restraint, from the conviction that silence, when anchored in truth, can split stone. She had every reason to scream, to retaliate, to spit fire the moment the trap was sprung beneath the studio lights. But instead, she opened a folder. She let the silence stretch, and in doing so, she taught a generation that dignity isn't weakness. It's resistance in its sharpest form. What she endured was not just a media ambush. It was the modern-day crucible for every woman of color who dares speak without apology. The host had tried to box her in. The lighting crew dimmed her presence. The producers sharpened their knives through editing. But Jasmine refused to shrink. Not because she was fearless, but because she had finally understood. The moment you let their frame define your fight, you've already lost. Her courage wasn't loud. It was deliberate. And in a culture that rewards volume over value, that kind of control was nothing short of revolutionary. She didn't just expose corruption, she exposed complicity, the quiet hands behind the camera, the legal insiders who whispered warnings but never stood beside her, the academics who taught case law but never questioned who wrote it. She made them all visible, and that visibility is power, because once seen, injustice cannot be unseen. She shattered the illusion that justice is blind. She showed the world that sometimes it wears tailored robes and trades truth for personal gain. But the deepest lesson came not in the courtroom nor in the viral clips. It came in the moments after. When Jasmine turned down the book deals the agent offers, the celebrity platforms. When she told a student, "I don't need to be a symbol," that was her answer to the entire spectacle. Not fame, not martyrdom, but multiplication. She didn't want followers. She wanted mirrors, reflections of courage replicating across courtrooms, classrooms, boardrooms, anywhere power once counted on silence. And that is where the story shifted from personal vindication to public legacy. Because every institution that tried to break her had relied on one calculation, that she would react emotionally, lash out, lose control, become the meme they could mock and discard. But she didn't give them the ending they'd written. She rewrote the genre altogether. And in doing so, she changed not just how we see power, but how we respond to it. Not with rage alone, but with truth, delivered like a scalpel. The human lesson here is sharp and sobering. Integrity will not always reward you with applause. In fact, it often leaves you standing alone in a storm of doubt and distortion. Jasmine Crockett learned that firsthand. She lost her congressional seat. She was mocked, baited, betrayed, even by those who once claimed to be allies. But she stayed in the fire, and not to survive it, but to expose what was burning underneath. Her fight wasn't just about one judge. It wasn't just about one corrupted episode of televised sabotage. It was about every unseen hand that pulls the levers behind closed doors and counts on the public never asking why. Her battle was against the myth of objectivity used to conceal bias, against the systems that weaponize decorum to silence dissent, against the comfortable lie that injustice wears only one face. And yet, in the heart of that fire, she held on to something most never expect to survive battle: empathy. Jasmine never demanded vengeance. She never called for her enemies to be ruined. She simply exposed the truth and stepped back. Because she knew the truth didn't need a spear, it needed light. And that is perhaps the most human lesson of all, that the most powerful justice does not roar, it reveals. She taught us that not all victories come in headlines. Some come in the eyes of a law student who decides to challenge a judge's ethics, in a producer who leaks an email because they've had enough, in a citizen who learns to ask, "Who profits from my silence?" She reminded us that dignity is a weapon, that silence, when chosen, is not surrender, it is strategy. That truth, no matter how long it is buried, waits for the brave to unearth it. And finally, most powerfully, that one voice, steady and unshaken in the face of design and deceit, can crack the most fortified halls of power. This is the legacy Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a slogan, not a brand, but a blueprint. A reminder that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be willing to stand. And as Jasmine stepped back into the quiet, leaving only the echo of her restraint and the tremor of her truth, one final question thundered louder than any gavel. What will we do now, when the silence is broken and the curtain has fallen? This isn't just a story to watch. It's a challenge to answer, because now we know the systems meant to protect justice can be manipulated, masked, bought, and exposed. Jasmine's stand wasn't a finale. It was an invitation. To students, question what you're taught. To voters, demand transparency from those who claim authority. To citizens, follow the money, not the slogans. To every silent witness who ever thought, this is just how power works, you were never powerless. The line has been drawn, the light has been turned on, and the next move is not hers, it's ours. So ask yourself, in a nation where truth barely survives the edit, will you be another viewer or the next voice that refuses to be framed? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.